Fantasy Football Week 15 takeaways. Aaron Rodgers returns, but now Antonio Brown is out. Looking for a takeaway from Week 15? Here's one: don't trust Jared Cook. Ever. Actually, the takeaway really should be shame on me, because 2 weeks ago I gave Cook a start over my usual tight end, Kyle Rudolph, only for Cook to score one measly point to Rudolph's 13. That should have taught me a lesson. But I was spooked this week by Rudolph's ankle injury and went back to Cook, only to see him get outscored 9-3 by his Vikings counterpart. Not a huge difference, but it might be enough to cost me a trip to the fantasy finals in the Washington Post League, not to mention a shot at an undefeated season. In other words, and to paraphrase Captain Kirk, Coooooooooook. Via Jiffy anyway. Now that I've indulged myself with that little rant, let's move on to some Week 15 takeaways that might be of more value to readers. Don't forget, though, never trust Jared Cook. Brown out, another week, another major injury to a fantasy superstar. At least there's optimism that Antonio Brown will be able to return from a reported partial calf tear in the NFL playoffs, but that really would be good news only for the Steelers and their fans. In the short term, his likely absence for the rest of the regular season would be a disaster for his fantasy owners at the least opportune time. If Brown is indeed out next week, though, that could set up Juju Smith-Schuster and Martavis Bryant for big days against the Texans' porous secondary. Welcome back. One rare dose of good news on the injured superstar front came from the return of Aaron Rodgers, who looked rusty against the Panthers, throwing 3 picks for the first time since 2009. But still racked up 3 TDs and almost 300 yards. With a game under his belt, Rodgers should be ready to rock in Week 16, assuming the team, with the playoffs almost certainly out of reach, doesn't shut him down, even against the stingy Vikings. But Jordy Nelson, 3 catches for 28 yards, continued to prove that he doesn't belong on a fantasy roster, let alone in a starting lineup. Quite the impersonation. One of the many outstanding facets of Carson Wentz's marvelous season was that he was so efficient, throwing 33 TD passes on just 440 attempts, for a TD percentage of 7.5 that ranked second in the NFL, to the also sorely missed Deshaun Watson's 9.3. With Wentz out, Nick Foles stepped in and the Eagles' offense seemingly didn't miss a beat, as he threw for 4 touchdowns on 38 passes. Spreading the end zone love to every relevant Philly receiver, Nelson Agholor, Alshon Jeffrey, Zach Ertz, plus Trey Burton. With a home date against the Raiders next, Foles has a great chance of keeping up his Wentzian ways. It wasn't pretty for Petty, another QB getting an injury-related start. Bryce Petty was about as lousy as expected, and he predictably took Robbie Anderson and Jermaine Kearse down with him. Petty's performance came in a tough matchup at New Orleans, but a home game against the Chargers next week doesn't sound much more promising for Anderson and company. Gurley, you can't be serious. Not a lot to take away here, except A, Todd Gurley is awesome, B, it's rather surprising that in an MVP caliber season, his hugest game has come at Seattle, and C, condolences to everyone who went up against him in the fantasy playoffs. Hey, you had a good run. That's sinking Thielen. Okay, I'll stop having cheesy fun with names soon. Adam Thielen picked a lousy time to set season lows in catches and yards, 330, his second dud in his past 3 games after being a portrait of useful consistency all season. It wasn't his fault that the Vikings had little need to throw the ball against a Bengals squad that looks eager to send Marvin Lewis into retirement before the season even ends. And Thielen's owners can hope Minnesota finds itself with more pressing offensive concerns at Green Bay. It's not easy starting Green, I said soon, not immediately. A.J. Green's status as an elite fantasy commodity has taken a bit of a beating this season, as Sunday's woeful outing, 2 catches, 30 yards, marked his 7th game this season with less than 75 yards and no TD. His owners likely will have to roll him out next week and cross their fingers in a matchup with Darius Slay and the Lions. And it might help if the Bengals go ahead and bench Andy Dalton for A.J. McCarron before the game starts. NFL's notorious catch rule resurfaces in decisive moment. Will it ever be changed? Double the displeasure. Holy moly, what a disaster Week 15 was for the Seahawks. At least Russell Wilson scored a few points for his owners, but the same can't be said for Doug Baldwin and Jimmy Graham, who combined for 5 yards on 2 catches. This was the second straight no-show for Graham, this after salvaging poor yardage days in weeks 13 and 14 with TDs, so he'll make for a very nervous Week 16 start. He's just that good, you know. It's one thing to come to terms with that fact that Blake Bortles is a good quarterback, at least in fantasy terms in recent weeks. But a world in which Bortles is so good that he just makes stars out of whatever receivers he's given? In a game in which the Jags, who had long since lost Allen Robinson and Allen Hurns, and barely had the services of a gimpy Mark Isley, Bortles used his magical arm to sprinkle 186 yards and a TD on Keelan Cole, and tossed another 2 TDs to Jaden Mickens. The only upsetting part is that fantasy darling Dede Westbrook, 2 catches, 21 yards, wasn't invited to the party, but that only shows that there actually are limits to Bortles' superhuman powers. Blake Bortles in December, 903 passing yards, 7 TDs, 0 INTs, and a 128.6 passer rating. Riley McCaddy, @Riley_McCaddy, December 17, 2017. No fluke. Any doubts that Kareem Hunt is back to being a stud were erased on Thursday, when he strafed the Chargers for 206 total yards and 2 TDs, after a big Week 14 game that followed a prolonged dry spell. Now Hunt gets the Dolphins at home in Week 16, giving him a great chance to both start and end the fantasy season with a trio of huge performances. Random House, pending the Monday night game, 9 players scored at least 2 rushing and/or receiving TDs in Week 15. 5 of them were established fantasy stars: Gurley, Hunt, LaShawn McCoy, Mark Ingram and Michael Crabtree. The other 4 were Mickens, Tommy Bahunan, Damiere Byrd and Tavares King. Everyone who started other Jaguars, Panthers and Giants had to be just loving that, he said sarcastically. Read more from the Post. Did he wants to buy the Panthers and sign Colin Kaepernick? Patriots hang on for a wild win over Steelers on emotional day in Pittsburgh. Packers. Davante Adams takes another brutal blow to the head. Flawed Packers weren't good enough for Aaron Rodgers.